This is the Building Automation Monthly Podcast with Phil Zito, episode 116, How Backnet Integrations Really Work. Hey folks, Phil Zito here, and welcome to the Building Automation Monthly Podcast, where each week we explore different building automation concepts to make you better in your career and to help you understand building automation. My name's Phil Zito, and I'm your host for the podcast. And what we're going to be covering over the next couple episodes is something that a lot of folks find challenging when they're entering their career in building automation. And heck, there's a lot of folks who have been in building automation for a long time and still don't really understand how this stuff works. What is this stuff I'm talking about? I'm talking about BACnet and how BACnet communicates with other BACnet devices, how devices are discovered, added, and just how do you tie all this stuff together? Don't worry, by the end of these 3 episodes, you'll have a very firm grasp on how all of this happens. But in order for us to do that, we need to lay some groundwork, some foundations for your BACnet understanding. Now, if you are someone who's maybe in sales or in management, I don't want you to get discouraged by this sounding like it's going to be a very technical episode or series of episodes. While it definitely will be technical in nature, there's going to be a lot of things that are included during these episodes that are going to be applicable to you, both managers and salespeople. So I really encourage you to listen through this as well. You'll get a really good understanding of why we use Backnet IP cards, why network design matters, all sorts of stuff. And for those of you who are more technical in nature, you'll get a appreciation and understanding for how all this stuff comes together, which I really think, based on my experience running the technical integration program at Johnson Controls, having been a service tech, having managed a operations team, that this will really help kind of round out some of those topics that just aren't clear. So here's what we're going to cover in this episode. We're going to dive through what BACnet is. We're going to get really solid and grounded on that. We're going to talk through the 2 most common physical network layouts of BACnet, and then we're going to go through kind of the common services and what all that stuff means. All right. So what is BACnet? I mean, really, what is it? Basically, BACnet is a protocol that was formed to essentially allow other devices, building automation devices, to communicate with one another in a way that was predictable, repeatable, and could essentially be used across a series of different devices. Now, this was done by creating a standard, and this standard is known as ASHRAE 135, and the most current version, as of me going in and looking, is 2016. Sure, there's been addendums, but 2016 is the most current major version. I tend to teach off of version 2012 because that's what a lot of devices in the market right now that are installed are based on, but the newer devices tend to be based on 2016. Now, why does that matter? Well, it matters because there's a slew of different capabilities in BACnet that these standards essentially say how all this stuff works. Now, when I say devices, what do I mean by devices? See, BACnet at its heart is a device and object-oriented protocol, meaning that devices, when you think of a field controller, when you think of a server, when you think of a BACnet VFD, those are all devices, but they're all objects at the same time. And this throws a lot of folks for a loop initially. You see, BACnet has over 54 objects. And the good news is that you don't need to know all 54 objects. As a matter of fact, you only need to know a sliver of the objects. There's only a couple that really matter to you as a BAS professional. Objects like the device object. That's a pretty important object because without having that, you're going to have trouble adding devices to your network. So you've got device objects, analog input objects, And you've got analog value, binary value, schedule, trend, all sorts of object types. Here's an analogy to kind of help you picture this, because I mean, it almost feels at times when I explain the device-object relationship that it's kind of like a catch-22, because a device is an object, and a device can have a list of objects that are devices. So, for example, you can have a supervisory device. So that would be like a JACE. For a lot of my listeners out there, you all are system integrators. Your primary product of choice is something based on the Niagara framework. So a JACE, an NE, PX, BCM, whatever, right? So supervisory devices. And supervisory devices have what's called an object array. And an object array is objects, basically a list of objects. An array is a list, essentially, right? So if you were to think of colors, right? If I were to have a box of crayons, and I can never pronounce that word right. My wife teases me about that. Crayons, crowns, whatever. Anyways, so you have a box of colors. There you go. And this box of colors has individual colors inside it, right? So orange, blue, purple. Each one of those crayons is an object. But this box is also an object, okay? So this box is an object and it's a device, right? The supervisory device is an object. And then you have a list of objects, which are also devices. I know, kind of confusing. And these devices themselves have objects. And those objects will tend to be analog inputs, analog values, things like that. So you can see right off the bat how this gets very, very, very confusing. But it doesn't have to be confusing. While that example may have felt confusing, and I did it on purpose for it to feel confusing, because I wanted you to feel what, some of you who may be experienced and you're like, man, I already know what devices and objects are. That's what it feels like when your new techs are coming and they're learning about devices and objects. It doesn't make sense. It feels very confusing and circular and just kind of foggy. Well, it doesn't have to be. It's actually really simple. Just think about it this way, right? I have a family. I'm married, I have a wife, and we have 3 kids. Each one of us is a person, right? But my wife and I, we have 3 kids that are also persons that are underneath us. So we're objects. We have a list of other objects underneath us, kids. And then our kids, when they grow up, they can have kids. And those are more objects. Well, BACnet is basically the same thing, right? You can have objects nested under objects nested under objects. And that's why it's really important to understand what the different objects are and their capabilities and what they support. Now, objects have properties. If you've ever messed around with BACnet, you've probably heard of present value. You've probably heard of the priority array. You've probably heard of device description, device type, device name, device ID. Those are all properties. These are all ways of describing the object. Some of these are writable. Some of these are not writable. They're only readable. But these properties are different based on the different object types. And these properties allow you to do things with the objects. For example, an analog input that has a property called present value. That is the present value. However, it does not have the priority array property, because how are you going to write to a physical input? You shouldn't be, right? If you are writing to a quote input, it should actually be an analog value. That would be where you would be writing to. And that would have not only present value, but it would have a priority array. That way you can determine what level of priority you're writing to. So you could go and say, hey, this is very important. I'm going to write it to a low priority. This is not so important. I'm going to write it to a higher priority. So you've got these different properties. Now, as we mentioned, we have objects and they have various types and they have properties. We also have this concept called services, and we'll talk much more about services later in this episode. But services essentially are capabilities that objects can enact. So these may be read properties, these may be write properties, these may be create object, delete object, who is, I am, etc. But services are the functionality. So to give you another analogy, a device may be a car. And that car may have several, or an object rather, may be a car. And that car object is a device. And that device car object has properties. Maybe one of the properties is how fast it's going, its speed. That would be equivalent to present value. And then maybe it has another property that is the actual manufacturer's name. That would be manufacturer's name property. Maybe it has a device name. That would be the name of maybe the car. Maybe you call it, Destructo, the magical Volkswagen Beetle. I don't know. I just wanted to say something goofy there. So you've got all these properties for this car device and object. And then it has services. It has the accelerate service. It has the brake service. You can see how all of that comes together. That's really important for you to understand. And if you get one thing out of this episode, it would be to have a really good understanding of object types, properties, and services. If you really understand these three things, then everything else with BACnet will make a lot of sense. Okay, so with that being said, you now have the 30-second flyby of BACnet object device architecture. Now we move on to the actual workings of BACnet. And while there are a lot of different physical networking capabilities of BACnet, ArcNet, peer-to-peer, BACnet LAN, BACnet Zigbee, etc., I'll be honest with you, those really aren't that important for you to learn. I know there's some die-hard, BACnet aficionados who are going to be freaking out right now, and they're like, oh no, you got no peer-to-peer because I have this one site that has BACnet peer-to-peer, and I've got ArcNet on it too, and it's okay, since you live back there in the 1970s, well, actually, BACnet wasn't even around in the 70s, but you live back in time, which the rest of the world has since passed you. Let's talk about what you're actually going to be using out in the field, which are BACnet MSTP and BACnet IP. So BACnet MSTP, also known as our serial network protocol, is what a lot of us are going to see out in the field coming off of supervisory devices. This is your field bus, your field trunk, whatever name you want to call it. This is where you have a series of devices sitting on a segment being a single run of wire, also known as RS-485, which is our wiring standard for MSTP, and it is essentially where we're running either 3 to 4 wires daisy-chained from device to device. That means we run from one device to the next device to the next to the next. And MSTP is master-slave token passing. So basically you have master devices, slave devices, and you pass a token around, and essentially a token allows you to embed the BACnet application data protocol unit, so the APDU, and that APDU has the data of whatever BACnet is going on. So BACnet service requests, BACnet service operations, etc., all sit on that token. And that token passes from device to device and passes back to the supervisory device. And that is how these BACnet devices work on MSTP. And essentially, as I mentioned, you have a trunk, right? So this trunk is a network connection, also sometimes known as a segment. And then you have a couple properties of that trunk that you need to be cognizant of. And those are the speed, the device IDs, and the MAC addresses that are on that trunk. So essentially, right, you have these BACnet devices, these field controllers, and you put them on the trunk. And you also have maybe some MSTP VFDs, you have some MSTP power meters, and in the next episode, we're going to be diving into MSTP, and we're going to explore an MSTP integration with a VFD. We're going to talk through how that would work, how things would communicate, and this should give you an appreciation towards how all that works, and also as well how to troubleshoot BACnet MSTP. So, BACnet MSTP, as I mentioned, is going to have a trunk, and that trunk has a speed rate, often known in bits, and that's like 38.4, 76.2, and I may not be memorizing these numbers 100%, but essentially you have these BACnet speed numbers, and all of the devices need to be communicating at the same baud rate. That's the measurement. And that baud rate is determining how fast message traffic can move across that network segment. Now, in addition to this, each device has to have a unique MAC address and a unique device ID. So the MAC address is the physical address, okay? I want to repeat that for a second. The MAC address for a BACnet device on MSTP and on IP is a physical address. Now, the BACnet MAC address on a physical device on MSTP is different than the MAC address on a physical device on IP. Okay? On IP, typically our physical MAC address is going to be hexadecimal, and it's going to be the address of the network card. Whereas on MSTP, our MAC address is going to be that 0 to 255 switch that has a series of dip switches, and we are going to turn those on or off using our 8-bit I'm like, I don't want to unpack this. I'm not going to unpack this. I'll unpack it in next episode. But essentially, we address our physical devices, okay? So, to this point, we have our network segment. Our network segment has a set speed. We have a series of devices on it. Each device has a unique MAC address, which is its physical address. And then it has its device ID, which is its application address, its logical address. So that is BACnet MSTP. Next, we come up to BACnet IP. Now, in the past, BACnet IP used to be supervisory devices and servers. But with the creation of BACnet IP field controls, we're starting to see a lot more BACnet IP devices nowadays. And what we're realizing is that we need to know more about how BACnet IP functions. And we need to know how BACnet IP functions with field controller devices, because in the past, it used to be that you had BACnet IP supervisory devices and servers. And so we would go and we would focus a lot on the discovery of BACnet IP devices and their objects, mapping those in, and we would focus a lot on BBMDs and things like that. But we didn't focus a lot in on essentially management of multiple BACnet devices across a network and how all this would look from an IP perspective. Now, I realize that that statement if you've never worked with BACnet IP, that may be a little bit vague. What I mean by that statement is essentially you may have a dozen BACnet IP supervisory devices in one server. And so when you're doing that, your IP traffic, I mean, it's very specific. What you tend to have as far as your BACnet IP traffic is you'll have some read-write properties or read-write services, and then you'll have essentially maybe some create object and delete object services. And, you'll see this happen a little bit. You'll mainly see the read and write properties, and you'll see the read and write properties between your server and your BACnet supervisory device, and between your BACnet supervisory device and your MSTP devices. But with all these new IP controllers, you're going to be seeing a ton of network traffic now. And what that means is that when you're trying to troubleshoot BACnet IP networks, you're going to be having to essentially get deep into Wireshark and really learn how to search for these services and make sure that these services are actually executing properly. Now, like I said, we're going to talk about services at the end of the episode, so don't worry, I'm not going to leave you hanging. But let's focus in on BACnet IP. So BACnet IP is a network-oriented IP, essentially implementation of BACnet, right? So you have a network segment, and that network segment, the BACnet network segment, will have a unique network ID. It will also have a port, and that port typically is 47808, known as BAC0, and it's UDP protocol. So we already know that with UDP, it's focused on the transportation layer of the OSI model, which if you don't know what the OSI model is, you really need to know that if you're going to be working with BACnet in any real depth. So with that being said, you have your unique network ID, you have your unique port ID, or your unique port, rather. You have a IP address along with a MAC address for the BACnet device, and then you have, once again, your device ID. Now, BACnet IP is going to communicate to each other on the local network segment simply using who is, I am, who has, I have services. However, if there are additional BACnet network segments and these devices need to go and send these kind of broadcast services, who is and who has, across the network, then what needs to happen is you need to have a way to send broadcasts, and you can't send broadcasts outside of a local network segment. That's a big no-no. Otherwise, there'd be huge broadcasts being sent across the internet, and these broadcasts would just be echoing all over the place, and it would eat up a lot of bandwidth, and then internet would just stop working. I know. You're like, okay. Don't worry, you don't need to dive too deep into what I just said. The important thing to know is that there's individual networks, just like there's individual zip codes at least in the US when you're mailing. And each one of those zip codes, you need to have essentially a post office for your mail to go to that post office from one zip code to another. That's basically a BBMD in BACnet world. BBMD has a list of all of the BACnet networks, and it is the method for saying, hey, I need to repeat this broadcast to another network to see who has this, who is this, and it repeats those services out, okay? So that is BACnet IP in a 30-second or about a minute nutshell. Don't worry. In the third episode of this series, we're going to dive pretty deep into BACnet IP. All right, the moment all of you, maybe, have been waiting for. Hopefully, you've been waiting for this. All right, and this is BACnet services. So there's really, what is this? Let me count my notes here. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 5 services that, based on my experience, these are the services you're really going to focus in on. And these services are the who is, I am, device discovery. Okay. And this is actually object discovery, or no, I guess I'd say it's device discovery. Yeah, to be honest. Although a device is an object, but this is device discovery. And this is who is this device? And then it'll say, I am this device. And then you'll say, oh, okay, well, I want to know who has this object. And then it will reply, I have this object. So basically, when you're going and scanning a BACnet network, you are going and scanning with a who is service. And then all the BACnet devices are responding with, I am this, I am that. And then once you have that device, you can then interrogate it using a who has service. And the who has is, who has this? And that device will say, I have this, and they'll give you the objects that they have. Then once you have those objects, you can go and read the properties of the objects or write to the properties of the objects if they support that. And let's say you want to add a device to a network. You can use the create object service. And let's say you want to add a object to a device. So you want to add an AI, an AV, a BV. Then you just use the create object on that device to create those objects. Now there's this thing called dynamic creation, which essentially dynamically creates the objects as the devices are created based on their BACnet profiles. Some objects support that, or some devices support that, some don't. I'm not going to really dive into that. That's more of an advanced concept. But you can see these services. So let's kind of circle back to the beginning of this episode. And I know for some of you, this is a very confusing topic. I know that protocols in themselves are confusing, BACnet being one of the more confusing ones, rivaled only by LAN for its level of confusion. So if you want to go really deep into these protocols and understand them at a really deep level, then I really encourage you to check out my upcoming protocol course, which it's not open right now at the time of this recording, but depending on when you're listening to this, it may be. So just check out the show notes, which I'll give you in just a second. With that being said, we went through BACnet at a very high level. We talked about what it is, how it consists of objects, and objects have properties, and objects support different types of services. We didn't talk through clients and servers. We will once we get into the next episode. And in the next episode, we're going to be diving through MSTP. So with that being said, this was one of the more deep episodes that we've went through so far in this podcast based on the requests from the survey. I've had folks saying, hey, I want you to dive a little deeper. I want you to go into systems integration. That's the thing. Systems integration at its core, it's not that difficult. I know that's easy for me to say, having, a lot of experience with system integration, but it's not. It's really a mastery of the protocols and a mastery of the processes. And so that's what we'll be diving through. We'll be diving through, protocols, processes, networking, databases, things, all those things that bring integration together. We'll be diving through those in the next, dozen or so episodes. With that being said, thanks so much for listening. Everything I discussed today can be found at buildingautomationmonthly.com/116. Once again, that is buildingautomationmonthly.com/116. I really appreciate you all being here. I'd love some feedback onto going into more depth on these episodes, what you think, if you like it. And as always, if you have any suggestions of topics to cover, I'd love to hear from you. Just reach out to me. And until next time, keep learning, keep improving, and continue to study and develop yourself. That's how you move ahead in this career. This career rewards people who invest in their own training, who spend time developing their skills. If you do that, you can develop a very successful and lucrative, meaning make a lot of money, career. So thanks so much. I will talk to you all again next week. Take care.